to get all my positions hired now, so that's awesome. Huge. Yeah, so
now you just gotta
feeling pretty good about that.
Get a booth next behind and tell him to get going on some of his long range planning.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Brian, you need to put like front row, back row.
So folks, I think we're about to get started here. This is our Parks and Open Space meeting. And Brian Wright here is going to be basically leading the discussion. He's with our consulting team, TPUDC. Definitely see a few familiar faces from some of our prior meetings. I'd like to welcome out any of the new faces that we haven't had here yet for this project. And of course, encourage you also to come out tomorrow evening to the closing presentation that we'll be doing, which is kind of just going to be a compilation of a lot of the comments and input that we've received during this past 3 days, and looking towards the future to having a new zoning ordinance that we can really have that can benefit all of us for the growth of the city. So I'm going to turn the time over to Brian, and we'll go from there.
There you go. All right. Great. Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate you taking time out of your weekend to do this. So as Brian said, I'm Brian also, and leading the team of consultants are back there working in the corner. So in addition to reporting back what we've heard at the presentation tomorrow night, we'll also be showing you work that we've been doing, and we'll be talking about our take on what we've heard. So maybe some suggestions or some thoughts about direction, that we're thinking, so we can get feedback on that to see if we're hearing correctly. So so if you've been at all of these meetings, don't think, oh, I shouldn't come because I've heard everything that's been said, because there'll be new things. If we could just quickly go around and do introductions, just say your name and if you represent a group or organization, or if you're a citizen, something like that.
My name's Josh King, representing myself.
My name is Jim Harrison. I live here in Gallatin, 1659 Boardwalk Place, but also work with the engineering and planning firm here in Middle Tennessee, CSDG.
I'm Hal Clark. I'm a planner and landscape architect with CSDG as well.
My name is Bill. I live at 1174 Potter Lane, and I work for Garrett Brothers Ready Mix.
Michelle Juvance. I'm a citizen. I live on Long Hollow Pike.
David Brown. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation for the City of Gallatin.
Sandra Kelly. I live on Jones Street. I'm a citizen.
Scott Oldham. I'm a lifelong resident. I live on Belvedere. I'm just a citizen.
I'm Rhonda Harris, and I'm just a citizen.
Caleb Harris, and I'm a citizen.
Nobody's just a citizen. I couldn't resist. I'm sorry. Paige Brown, City of Gallatin Mayor.
Matt Harris. I'm the chairman of the City of Gallatin Planning Commission.
Aaron Allison. I'm District 2 of the City Council.
Anna Blevins. I'm a planner and project manager with TPUDC.
I'm Bill McCord. I live at 921 Belvedere Drive, and I'm a resident of Gallatin.
Hi, Michelle Martin. I'm here representing Jeffrey L. Duderino, the Music City Terrier. Very interested in the doggy park. You might not see him down here, but he can't speak, so we're going to speak for him. Citizen.
I'm Doug Coda. I'm also here with Jeffrey. I'm a security detail. And I am also a resident of Gallatin.
All right. Oh, hello.
Hi, I just came in a few minutes late. I'm Linda Love. I'm Vice Mayor of Gallatin currently.
Perfect. All right, so this is the Parks and Open Space meeting, and so if you haven't been to one of these meetings yet, it's just a free-form discussion. I'm hitting microphones and taking notes. and just picking your brains. What are the things we need to know about? The conversations tend to wander. We'll try to keep it within the topic to some extent, but I tend not to try to lead too much. So anybody have any thoughts about parks and open space? How you doing? We got enough parks, got enough open space. It's a short meeting or a long meeting? We have 1 hour.
And if people want to speak, because these air conditioners are so loud, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. If you want to answer any of the questions or make a comment.
There we go.
Well, I guess somebody's got to be first. Yeah, I live on Belvedere, which is right off of Lot 4 Road. And I'm assuming Gallatin now has possession of what used to be the Corps of Engineer parks, the Lakeside Parks, 1, 2, and 3. Is that correct? I think they're pretty nice, but I think they're very underutilized now. I mean, they're very nice places, right on the lake, very beautiful. I think they're underutilized. And the other comment, kind of go along with it, Lot 4 Road is not very conducive. Well, it's not conducive at all for people walking, jogging, or biking because it's so narrow. I know it'd be a major undertaking, but I would suggest maybe it get kind of redone to add a bike lane, sidewalks, because I just think it's very underutilized, especially the very end of Lot 4.
Great, thanks.
We were hoping some discussion on the dog parks. So we know the dog park at Triple Creek just needs a little bit of love, or maybe a new dog park in another area. We drive out to White House probably a couple times a week just for their dog park. So that would be wonderful if we could discuss that.
Okay, great.
So on that note, the greenways, we really do like the greenways. It's a beautiful greenway that goes up to Triple Creek, but once we get there, the dog park is very lacking. The fences are a little too high, so smaller dogs can get under there. The ground is very uneven. I rolled my ankle running after the dog one time. Like I said, we do like going up to White House because their dog park was really good. So maybe we could touch on that.
Great. Yeah.
Dog barked at me.
I concur about the dog park. I've taken my dog twice, and I don't really want to bother going back with my dog because it just doesn't have anything, and it's kind of nothing. And the other thing, I think we do need more dog parks in other areas. I live on Long Hollow Pike, and there's some big apartment complexes right there. There's one on the corner of Long Hollow Pike and 386, and driving home just recently, twice, I've seen two different people with their dog, 2 different times, like different people with a different dog that live in those apartments, like down in the other property that's adjacent to it where there have been more apartments approved. I guess you all probably know what I'm talking about, where they're going to put more apartments, but right now it's just a big old open field. And so they're over there playing with their dogs because there's nowhere for them to play with the dogs inside the apartment complex development. So I think that's something that we need in my area. There's no parks at all in my whole entire area of the city. And so the people that have dogs that live in these apartments, they're going to like other private property owners' land and like treating them like parks. So that's a thing.
Yeah. Well, and to that end, especially since we're thinking about zoning, do the new neighborhoods or new developments that are going in have nice parks in them? You know, can you think of one that's like, oh yeah, that's a great example of a park, and maybe one that's not?
No, actually, I think if you're an example, the Nexus development that went in has got some pretty nice amenity centers. They've got a park and a lot of open space, and I think there's a dog park planned for part of that. I don't know if it's been constructed yet, but they're also taking advantage of areas that would normally have been a floodplain and making it available for those types of uses. So, kind of talking more about the zoning ordinance update, things we're talking about. I think, you know, kind of going to open space requirements in the residential zonings, and I'm looking forward to a part of this process, there being better clarification about allowable uses for open space and qualifications. And to that point, you know, making sure we have more guidance of you know, creating areas for dog parks in, you know, property that may not be suitable for building on, but that, you know, I think by specifying that, you know, using areas that might be, you know, in a 100-year floodplain, you know, once a year it might be an issue, but those are great opportunities to create spaces like that. But trying to encourage developers to do that through the zoning process would be a good start.
Could I ask, I can just say it.
It has to go on the microphone. So
Can
they
I
can hear
ask
you
this
online.
gentleman, what does White House have that we don't, that you really like, or suggestions from that area?
Okay, so I don't want to advertise for White House, but they have a really nice dog park. There's two sections. There's a small dog and a large dog section. They have trees. The ground is relatively level. The fence it covers the entire area. They have water fountains that you can get water inside the dog park for the dogs. They usually have some toys around and stuff. The big thing is it's a very clean park, and it's a very nicely laid out park. And what it does is it draws people to come there and bring their dogs. So for us especially, we bring him to the dog park for socialization. He gets to meet other dogs, he meets people, and dogs love to play with other dogs. If he was just going to run around, we have a yard, we can let him run around there, but we like to bring him someplace where he can meet new dogs, and that socialization is great for them. It keeps them calm, and it keeps them level, and, you know, get some exercise. So we like to bring him where a lot of other people go, and that park does draw a lot of other people.
And they also have a committee, I think, that runs it, and I think it's just civilian volunteers that could help once it's done, maintain it, and they do a lot of events. I think that brings the community together, which is really nice. Oh, do you know?
What is it called? Rovers? I can look it up.
Rover's Ridge.
Rover's Ridge. And it's within a park complex where they have like baseball fields, football fields, soccer fields. Again, sorry to advertise for White House.
I was just looking for the suggestions.
Yeah, I agree.
So over the past several days, we've heard a lot of, you know, people saying, you know, there's concern about the rate at which you're growing and you're losing all your open space and those sorts of things. When you have open space that's required in new developments, I'm assuming that what I'm hearing is it's not enough, or is it just that when you get a development, the development isn't something that you're excited about, so you'd rather not have had something at all? Like, yeah.
So I think that the open space isn't defined to be a usable kind of open space. Like can I give 2 examples of just from when I've observed like things going through the process in the past? Like, for example, the Cumberland Point townhouse development, which is off Highway 25. That development actually, I think it was 10 or 12 acres, and they put 100 townhouses on it, but they're calling it 27 acres with 100 townhouses because they took open space from the development across the highway to add to that development, but this was open space that was literally inside of the flood zone, and they were going to put a playground in that open space so that they could meet the open space requirements for that Cumberland Point townhouse development. And to me, I found that just completely, utterly ridiculous that they would have the kids' playground that they were putting in across a highway for a townhouse development. Like, who's going to allow their kids to just go walking across a highway over to like a different development along a big old pathway down into a playground in a flood zone? And this was something that was allowed to happen so that they could put 100 townhouses with literally no open space except for just a pond in the middle that was like for the drainage. So to me, that's not good for the people who are going to be living in that townhouse development, because to me, I think that would just be something that would be uncomfortable and not very fun to live in, especially if you have children, right? And then another thing that I've witnessed with a different apartment complex off of Greenlee Boulevard, you see kids like playing, because they're going to play outside, and they're like in these big massive retention pond areas that are just like sloped, and they're just playing there, and they're rolling down the slopes and playing, and that's fine, like if there's no water in it. But what if they're full of water? There's nowhere for them to play. So I think that the issue is that the developers are allowed to call things open space that aren't actually like useful for the residents of that development, and we need to fix that.
Yeah.
You can't blame the developers. Of course they're going to do whatever they're allowed to do, right?
Sure.
But we need to not allow them to do that.
Yeah. Well, and there's a couple of different things. I mean, obviously, that example is except for in places where they have what's called transfer of development rights, where you can essentially sell your development rights to another development, and that makes this over here be open space, and now the developer can do something more than they could have done otherwise. I've not heard of something like that, so I'm guessing it probably doesn't happen all the time on all the developments. But so just taking the peculiarity out of that, one of the things that I always encourage people to think about when they're concerned about something that's happening in development is, like you said, well, but the people who live there, that's not going to be great for them. Well, then they don't live there, so like somebody will choose to live there or not, so you might not like it, somebody else might not mind it, or whatever. So I wouldn't worry about it from that perspective. Obviously, we want everyone's quality of life to be as wonderful as it can be. I think the bigger question about is, should you be able to have your open space not be associated with your project, is a different thing. I wonder if the developer really makes a case that the kids from these townhouses are going to go across the highway. It sounds more like I'm trying to beat the math, and so here's how we did it, and those things happen sometimes, and it's not necessarily the end of the world. But if the standards are calibrated correctly, so that you do have the sufficient amount of open space that's necessary for people to enjoy and have, great quality of life. And I've talked also the past couple of days about each development being additive or subtractive from the quality of the character of the overall Gallatin, right? And so when somebody goes through a neighborhood, even if they're not living there, the neighborhood sends a message to them about what is this city like, right? And so you want your neighborhoods to have all those things, like, oh, these neighborhoods clearly have parks and open spaces and dog parks or whatever the case may be. So there's a bigger picture necessity for these things, and then there's the more localized for the people who live there. So I think that we can sort these things out. Sometimes, in the zoning ordinance, you'll see open space, and you'll have like multiple types of open space. So maybe it's formal open space, maybe it's natural space, We talk about civic spaces the way we do zoning. So we'd have parks, plazas, dog parks, playgrounds, greenways, all of these different things. And it's because they're also defined and they're allocated in different character zones in our zoning districts. You can't really just send it over there, it needs to be associated with the development it's in. So yeah. Microphone? Oh, hold on.
I just wanted to reply back to, because you made a comment like I can't say that that wouldn't be good for the people who live there, but I am saying that because I did talk to someone who does live there who has a son, and he said that.
Sure,
It's
yeah.
not, he does not like that.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, he lives there.
No, absolutely. And I guess all I'm saying is, and you are certainly welcome to say that too. I wasn't suggesting you shouldn't say it. All I'm saying is what tends to happen is people just make choices and they say, okay, well, I'm going to live here and I moved in and I didn't really think about the open space not being here. Oh, this is a bummer. Now I'm moving, or now I'm just going to accept it, so that's all I meant.
One of the things that I'm curious about, to both of your points, is the interface between the private development open space that may or may not be required but may be part of a project, and then how that relates to the public open space. Is it encouraged, or does it ever happen that the private development is responsible for some park space and then it's then deeded over or turned over to the city as a part of the overall city parks and recreation plan? And how does that, is that a good thing? Is it not a good thing? Is it something that the city wants? And I'm interested in how all that kind of goes together, because a lot of times the private development is a part of building and implementing park space, and oftentimes it's really good park space. Sometimes it's more oriented to the people who live in that development, but when it's turned over to and becomes a public park, just interested in how all that happens here in Gallatin.
Thank you. And there's a new recreation plan being developed, so whatever is incorporated into the zoning code needs to take into consideration that recreation plan, which I guess is going to be mostly facility-based, but there may be level of service standards for acreage and things of that sort. It's not always appropriate to require a private open recreation area with every private development, particularly if there's a large park next door. Maybe the facility or donation in lieu of land, if you will, is more appropriate. One thing I do want to point out is that example that was given for Cumberland Place resulted in an area created for active recreation that is not only available for Cumberland Place, but the larger neighborhood that it's adjacent to it. And it is built in an area that's between two creeks, and recreation, fortunately, most recreation, passive recreation included, can be accommodated in flood zones. So most of the greenway network that the city has adopted, it follows creeks. And so there's a great opportunity for the public, and Nexus is an example of that, public-private partnership, to where public facility through an easement is going to be provided parallel to those creeks that will provide access for the public, but also they have their own on-site recreation. There is a need in the zoning code for certain zoning districts that don't have a required open space, and that probably needs to be addressed. Some multifamily districts don't require. They may provide a pool or something of that sort. So maybe there is a need, whether it has to be on their property or not, or it can be a donation to the city in some other aspect, is certainly appropriate. Otherwise, you don't want a private developer essentially creating a recreation area that's open to the public, that's going to be an obligation to the city, because otherwise you're just going to unload on the city, and that may overburden the city's capability of maintaining those. So, but there does need to be some better coordination and some requirements for facilities and/or open space with residential development in each zoning district that they can provide on their site or coordinate with the city to provide. There's also a county recreation plan. So, and it has some suggestions. Of course, greenways are a big part of recreation these days, so that needs to be included as well. Consideration of that. And I think we had talked yesterday about tree preservation, so that, and I'd mentioned in a one-on-one session that it would be important for the city to consider some sort of tree preservation, particularly for vacant properties and/or commercial properties, or non-residential properties other than multifamily, that ensure the preservation of certain species of trees or size of trees. And with that, I think I had something else to say. Oh, yeah, the other thing I want to encourage is provide incentives that when stormwater basins are constructed with new development, that they be designed in such a way that those stormwater facilities can be incorporated and used as and qualify as recreation open space as well, whatever ratio is established.
Yeah.
And many times they do that. You just don't want to build a retention pond with a big 8-foot chain link fence around it and becomes a weed and maintenance burden and much less aesthetic issue.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. Good comments. One, I think part of the conversation we're having is really split. There's a difference between open space and amenities in a development. You know, the amenities in a development are things that developers going to put in to make their product more attractive. And you know, we've mentioned Nexus a few times already today, so we'll can use them as an example. There's what they did with their pools, their parks. There's areas that they could have built on that they've developed that as open space amenities for the whole community to use. And it's in that case it's something that they're dedicating, they're building it. It's that park, it's the recreational space to encourage people to have a certain lifestyle in the neighborhood. And the neighborhoods like a Fairview Plantation, Foxland, they've got golf courses, they've got open areas of land that could have otherwise been built on, but they built those with that amenity because it attracts that certain type of person. And I think, and I've said it several times, one of the things I want to see us focus on as a city is diversity of housing options. Right now we're seeing a lot of the same type of housing product. I think some of that's market driven with interest rates and just housing demand on a national level. But I think, to ensure that we're having not just the same type of housing coming to the city because people know they can get it approved here. So that is something that's I think it's a real concern. And through this zoning update, I hope we see some more incentives for more diverse offerings of housing product, because I do think that's something that's important. We've made it so expensive to develop, not just here, but in a lot of places, that you're not going to see another Fairview Plantation, another Foxland Harbor. To develop neighborhoods like that is not economically viable anymore. Because I know several people who've looked at them and the math just doesn't work. And so, but kind of going back to where I started, that is, when we're talking about open space, I think it is important that we have those open space requirements to ensure that developers don't come in and start putting in underground stormwater detention because they can make more money doing that and building more units on the property than using an attractive detention pond or area and calling it open space. There's a misconception, I think, sometimes that people only do open space on land that's unbuildable. Sometimes it's just that it's not economic to build on it. But as the city continues to grow and you get more infill development, all of a sudden that 3-acre piece of land that didn't make sense to build on 10 years ago is now worth enough money that it's worth putting millions of dollars into underground stormwater or making it buildable. and now you're losing the chance to preserve it by not having pathways to encourage good development with the open space. So not sure where all that gets us in the conversation, but I think encouraging developments to offer amenities to attract those buyers and having a diversity. I think there is a place for the townhome development that maybe doesn't have a lot of park and recreation space. There's people that's not what they're looking for. But at the same token, when you have good diverse housing options, you're going to have a project that has a mix of things. Going back to Nexus, they have a townhome section right next to their pool, a very nice park, and there's a buyer, a consumer that's looking for that lifestyle, and they're going to go find that. And what we need to be careful of is that we don't encourage only one type of development, so that we do create the very problem. Michelle, to your point on the Cumberland Point, I actually agree with you on that one. I never liked how that project utilized the area across the street, because it really was never feasible for it to be accessed safely. And through this process, I think something to bring to the discussion is, when a project is bringing open space that is meant to be used as recreation space. Had that project just used the open space to meet the requirement, but it wasn't being sold as a playground and a park for the kids to use while crossing the very busy road, it's a different conversation. But if we're going to use open space for an amenity, essentially, I think we do need to take a look at how accessible is it for the people that are living in the neighborhood to access if that's what's being sold to the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I think is probably true, just to show that I don't disagree with the point you were making earlier, by the way, the smaller the parcel that the unit is on, the less private open space you have, i.e. yard, the more you need neighborhood parks. So a townhouse or multifamily, you actually need it more so than even in a single family, because at least in single family you have a yard, or at least a courtyard or something. So yeah. Oh, back to what you said too a second ago about incentivizing multiple different types of housing in the development. I guess my question is, rather than incentivizing it, since we're writing the zoning, can we just require it? Is that something you guys have thought about at all? So, yeah.
I don't know that we've broached the topic of requiring it. I'm throwing it out just as a topic of conversation, because I think it's important. The mechanism we use to achieve it, I don't know. But some of that, and I think I said at our kickoff meeting with the joint session with council, is when we finish this project with the zoning ordinances, open space, all these conversations, I really do think we need to go back and look at our character maps that we did with Plan Gallatin, and with the new zoning update in mind, go back and look at where do these zonings now make sense now that we've updated this antiquated zoning ordinance, to where we can go back and look, okay, listen, that density, that development type, this percentage of open space, it makes sense here, it doesn't make sense over here. I think, most people can understand that there's a need for housing, and through this process, can we drive where that housing density goes to where it's less of a burden on the city for the infrastructure and the cost of maintaining it, and also fits in with the character of the areas. And, Plan Gallatin was a starting point, but it's not the end all be all. Those areas need to be revisited as a follow-up to this process. Yeah. So, and I think through that is how we get some better guidance on how areas develop. So the Long Hollow Pike corridor, that makes a lot of sense for larger lot, single family, bigger open space. Something that's in the downtown core makes more sense for the higher density because it's walkable, it's got more use for the amenities. But I think these are two projects that go hand in hand.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk on some of the points that you were making about preservation, about density and open space, and I think that before I moved here, I came from Los Angeles. I lived in LA for 16 years. So I get accused a lot of being negative and like trying to say like we need to like not keep approving all this high density. And I'm coming from a perspective of having lived in a very crowded place where you could literally drive for 2 hours and see nothing but concrete. And so I'm just seeing that coming here, and I don't want that to happen to Gallatin. And so that is my perspective of why I say what I say. And this is something, when we talk about preservation and high density, and we started hearing like, oh, we need high density to preserve the open space in 2020, I believe. It was when we were doing the Plan Gallatin, and we started hearing that. Oh, we need, if we have high density, that will preserve the open space. And I said, no, that is not true. That is only number one of that conversation, because if you have high density, but you're not actively preserving the open space, then all you're going to eventually have is high density as far as the eye can see for hundreds of miles. You're high, just like LA, you're just going to have concrete for hours of driving, because that is what happened there, and I've experienced living there, and it's a very uncomfortable sort of life to literally drive home from work and not have somewhere to park your car because it's too crowded, and there's just not enough room, and there's too many people that have been crammed into too small of a space. And so that is why I am so vocal, and I sound like I'm being negative, and I'm accused of being negative, but I'm really just trying to say, warning, warning, please don't let that happen here, because it's not a fun experience of a life. So I want to have something in place where, okay, if you want to put high density, then yes, require to have some sort of active, preserved open space somehow that cannot then be taken, going back to the Cumberland Point thing again, oh wow, there was a lot of open space in that Fairway Farms, but now Fairway Farms has less open space because it was taken and put into Cumberland Point, because Cumberland Point is more crowded. But I mean, I guess the open space is still there, but it didn't actually preserve more open space. It just used what was already open space. So I don't know, that's a loophole, I guess, and I don't know, what is the solution? How do you do that? How do you actively preserve something where people can enjoy a park and enjoy the trees if they're going to live in a very dense sort of development?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, all of those questions are things that are easily solvable. And they're things that, to me, it's surprising that you guys are even struggling with those things. So I guess I could say, I hear you, and we'll fix it. I mean, unless you guys won't let us, there may be reasons why you don't currently do these things, right? So we'll tell you how to fix it, and then you guys can vote and decide if you want to allow it. To your point about developing more densely to preserve, it is true that it does preserve to some extent, because you have a finite amount of people who are interested in moving here. However, at some point, it will fill up, right? It will, if you continue without actively preserving as you grow, you will fill up. LA has just been there long enough that it did fill up, So it's hard, though, because for a few reasons. Hard to preserve because of what you were just talking about, taxing, overburdening the city's ability to manage, maintain, and all of that if it becomes, if it's given over to the city. And then on the other hand, as you've, in the past not been as much in the bullseye of growth, you've wanted people to come and develop here. And so it's hard to be like, oh, you can develop here, but you can only develop a little bit of it. And then when they do, then they give you the leftovers, and the leftovers are usually tucked away in the back or whatever. And there's a whole, I keep talking about our private development projects we work on. When we see creeks and floodplain and tree groupings and all of that stuff. Even where we need to have stormwater features or whatever, we see that as an amenity as much as a clubhouse or a pavilion or whatever. And so we actually orient buildings towards that. The buildings face that instead of being tucked away, so nobody even realizes it's there except for the person who might live next to it. And now that open space is essentially privatized. Even if it's not on someone's lot, you feel a bit creepy lurking around in the forest behind someone's house. Am I supposed to be here? Is that okay or not? And so there are ways in which you can, through clever planning, actually make these what seems to be leftover spaces actually the stars of the community. But if they're not done with a holistic park system in mind, you could be just ever so close to another bit of green space where you could have connected and you could have had the benefit of the habitat connectivity for birds and other things, and the trails you could walk from one to the next and all. So if you're not thinking about it big picture like that, you miss opportunities. And so that can all be incorporated as well, in the same way that most cities these days don't allow people to not connect roads between developments because of all the traffic stuff we've been talking about. So you don't do cul-de-sacs. You similarly so you say, well, what about if one development goes in before the other? Well, your road stubs into the property line and it's ready for the other development to hook right in. Same thing you can do with trails. So one trail hooks up, another trail is going to come in, and now you've all of a sudden gotten this massive, amazing trail network that the developers have built for you. So you're now getting something like, hey, at least we're getting a trail network and a greenway and a dog park and all these things. So we can solve all these things.
Also, I have 3 questions. 24-year-old, not very intelligent. But the first question is, how is a park created? How does the city decide, this is economically viable for the city to build this park or support this park? Second question is why don't parks have, I take Triple Creek, for example. I'm a big runner. I like to run out there on the Greenway after work. And I'm always like, this would be a great place for a smoothie shop right next to the soccer fields or a CrossFit facility for people to work out at. Why isn't there more private public partnerships with our parks? And then my third question is it's kind of a statement that leads to a question. I've been to LA. It's not fun. I did not enjoy it. But it's one thing I learned in school is if you tax a development with regulations or forcing them to build certain things, they're just going to pass that cost down to the ultimate consumer, which is the homeowner. And as a 24-year-old thinking about housing prices, because I'd like to buy a home, and they keep going up, if we keep putting all these regulations and restrictions for stormwater or having to have a certain amount of green space, that's just going to cause, or impact fees, it's going to cause the cost of the homes to rise higher so the developer can still get their profit, which they deserve for putting in all the work. How can we incentivize the green space without making it a big cost on the developer that ultimately costs the homeowner more money in the long run?
Yeah, that's a good question. Good questions. So as far as how the city decides, I'll let the city answer that, but I have one thought. What you'll see these days is not very many city parks being built like they once were. It used to be that, if there was a park, the city was like, of course we'll build a park. Our citizens need a park. Times have changed, and more often than not, cities are looking to the developers to create the space. And but we do get new parks sometimes. However, often the parks are what I would call opportunistically located, and so the city's like, oh, we've got that land over there, even though that's not where a park really wants to be, but we need a park, so let's make a park, and that's where it is. And you're like, well, how did it get over there? And you're like, well, that's what we had available, and it was much cheaper than if we went and bought some other land. So that's a high level, but I'll let you guys.
So talking about parks, I'm not originally from Sumner County. I'm a native to Nashville. So I grew up in East Nashville long before it was cool to be from East Nashville. So anybody that's been around Tennessee for 30 or 40 years remembers a time when Dickerson Road and Trinity Lane was not a place you went after dark, but that's where I grew up. And, you know, and to the point, it's similar to that Los Angeles style development pattern around the outskirts of Nashville. When I was a kid, it was block after block of house after house. There was no such thing as open space. There was no common area. The closest park to my house as a kid was 1.5 miles away. And so, you know, my brothers and I rode our bikes through some pretty rough neighborhoods to get to go to the park that was, quite frankly, run down. But that's where you played, you know, or you played in the ditch in the front yard when it rained because it was a swimming pool, you know, but those were different times. And, you know, I think when you do the city parks, and there's a place for those, Triple Creek for those big ones, I think as times and development patterns have changed, we see these smaller pocket parks and subdivisions where, you know, when we were in between building houses years ago, we lived for a couple of years in the Creekside Station Camp subdivision. It's over off Long Hollow Pike. And it's got a nice kind of recreation complex to it. It's got a really nice greenway area that runs down through there. And the kids that lived in the neighborhood had somewhere to go. They weren't having to ride 1.5 miles or so to go find that public city park. So, so I do think it's a little different. And go back to a comment made about like the stormwater areas being where they can be an amenity. Is actually so about a year ago, my office manager and her fiance started looking for houses, and they looked at everything from townhomes to homes in Fairview Plantation on the golf course, a very wide price range. And they ultimately settled on a townhome over off of Browns Lane area in Greenlee. And she was actually telling me how excited she was because she was able to get the lot that backed up to the stormwater pond, and it only cost her an extra $15,000 to get that unit because it was something that was nice to look at. So to the point, when it's done correctly, that stormwater, that open space can, you know, there's an incentive for a developer to do it well and do it right because they can actually charge a premium for those lots when they do it.
Yeah. Well, and to your question about once you make more requirements, it adds more costs and it gets passed on. I mean, to some extent that is true. However, the developers know that the consumer is only going to pay what they're going to pay, right? And so at some point, yes, it actually does start eating into the developer's bottom line, and they will accept it. And I say that having worked for nearly 20 years for developers. They don't like it. They'd rather it not. And I guarantee you, because you have the same developers who are building here as they're building in other communities, and they probably are loving it here because their margins are higher here for the same product because you guys don't make them do the same thing that other cities do. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to add a little bit to what you were saying, because what we've seen in different communities is they get really close on open space and parks, and they sometimes require private development to kind of do their fair share, and they add to the overall system. But what they miss sometimes is the opportunity, like you were just talking about, to really zoom out a little bit and look at how this all functions together, because every little development could be responsible for its own little piece of that. But if there's not a vision, and if there's a lot of missed opportunities there when you don't kind of look at this with the vision of, okay, well, this private development has a piece of recreation here. This private development, we can encourage them to like add on to that and capitalize on something that something else is doing. And if you really have that vision to look at these and maybe capitalize on some of the things that the adjacent pieces are doing, then it becomes a bigger impact, if that makes sense. And sometimes that little piece of that is missed in an overall community, and you just miss out on something that could be a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah. To your question also about why not having commercial ventures within parks or like a smoothie shop, whatever, and that's a great question. You know, you see in Europe all the time, they've got, you know, cool little kiosks and things, or in older cities in the U.S. too. That think about like Bryant Park in Manhattan. You know, they've got, you know, this amazing waffle stand and a bunch of things. You know, it's yeah. exactly. It's a bit tricky, you know. It's a bigger city, it's easier to do that in, but why not allow somebody to have a business there, you know? And so if you don't have a commercial use allowed in a civic space or an open space or park, then you can't have it. So that's something that we should consider doing, because I mean, a lot of people think about it. You go to a park, you know, wouldn't it be great if you could grab a sandwich, you know, when it's if right next to the trail, grab your drink, your smoothie, whatever. So, yeah.
I love this theme that we're kind of talking about, making open space easy to access, right? You know, it stinks to have to go 1.5 miles to find your open space. And I'm familiar with a development. When I lived in Arizona, there was a development that went in that they purposefully planned for every home within their development to have easy access. They were within 1/8 of a mile of a park, whether it be a small little reading area park or maybe a dog park, or maybe a bigger park where there were, you know, soccer fields or something like that. But, you know, easy, good access for the residents to be able to get to these parks, I think is imperative to provide as a city. Now, who maintains that? That's likely, a lot of the times it'll be an HOA that deals with that, right? There may be very few instances where the development would dedicate land to the city so that the city then deals with maintenance long term. But that's going to be likely a small amount of times versus the times when it's, you know, an HOA driven deal and they're going to maintain that long term. As far as the retention basins, you know, I think that if you don't use that for usable open space, it's a massive missed opportunity, right? You need it as a dual use if you can possibly get it, you know, whether it's for, you know, actual storage of water, like, you know, having a house that's behind somewhere that's constantly filled with water, maybe that's a nice looking place. But also, I mean, you could put, if you design it the right way and big enough, you can put a little soccer field down in the bottom of a retention basin where, you know, 350 days out of the year, you're probably going to have availability to play soccer down in that field. And then the other 15 days of the year, when it may be filled up with rainwater, you're going to have some rainwater and kids won't be able to go out and play during that time. But for the most part, you have this amenity that kids can go out and use. And I mean, it's a great opportunity. Same thing with your electrical easements. I mean, there's nothing stopping people from plopping a trail into an electrical easement and making some sort of recreational ability. While that's something that you can't really do anything else with because you can't put structures in there, you could put a trail in there and get some recreational ability through that. So dual use of these types of spaces, I think, is also imperative.
Yeah, but
So.
to do that, though, we've got to make sure that the engineering standards for these aspects are not hideous looking, which is typically the case. So, like, if riprap is part of the detail, if you know what riprap is, it's those big gray rocks that are dumped out. Like, it's not so great. Like, we're staying at the new Comfort Inn hotel over there, and they've got this stormwater thing, and it's like pretty nice looking. It's pretty new, so it hasn't really established, doesn't quite look like a wetlands yet, but it's pretty nice. But then there's like this part of it where there's this riprap dam or whatever, and I'm like, oh, couldn't you have at least made it look a little more natural or done something a little different there, you know? So, yeah, you don't want it to look like an engineering feature in the middle of a park, right? No offense to the engineers.
I kind of want to piggyback on that. One of the things I had written down I wanted to talk about is having flexibility in trail types. Because we were on vacation, and the place that we were staying had a lot of nature trails, a lot of much less intrusive in those wooded areas where you can hold to the existing ground. You can preserve the mature trees in the natural areas the way that you want to. Many times, speaking as an engineer, many times engineers have, have to have perfect grades, and that just doesn't. Sometimes that's appropriate, but it's not always appropriate. And I think having that flexibility. Also wanted to say, and my father passed away about 4 weeks ago, and my father, who was a ranger on Old Hickory Lake and Percy Priest, and then served down with the psychiatric hospital in Murfreesboro. The last 5 years of his life, we would go walk along the trails in Murfreesboro along Stones River. And the thing that was unique about those spaces is the mature trees, the nature things, and the historic things that you saw with the battlefields. And I think those are the things, the mature trees is what we have left, because for the most part, agricultural things took out everything but the mature trees along the creeks. It's important, I think, for us to preserve those things that we can't replace.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, we're working on one of our private development projects in Wilson County, and our client wanted to put, I don't know, a couple miles of trails on there. It's it's like 400 acres, I think the site is. And the county said, well, if you show those trails on that map, they all have to be asphalt, 8-foot wide trails, ADA accessible. And I was like, well, that's not the vibe at all that we want. And I was like, well, what's the requirement? How much trails do we have to do? Can we just do the minimum amount of trails and just call that asphalt, and whatever else is the Boy Scouts come put in or whatever? And they're like, oh, we don't have any requirements for trails, but if you show them on your plane, you got to do it. And I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How are you you're disincentivizing people to do trails, even if you don't have any requirement for them. And so we took them all off, and we're, hopefully the developer won't change their mind down the road. But they saw it as an amenity, so they wouldn't change their mind,
Well, that's an example that I was going to actually make too, and similar to what we talked about yesterday with some of the other regulations and zoning districts and everything that we're doing. One of the important things to think about is the perspective that you're talking about. I'll use stormwater for example. One of the important things is when you're crafting these new requirements and these new standards, that you allow people to do some of those things, and you don't inadvertently write a regulation that prohibits people from doing a mulch trail, for example, or doing a boardwalk or rain garden type thing in the stormwater area. I mean, it's important to make sure that you're not intentionally, but you're not actually writing these regulations that simply doesn't allow for some of these things to happen. Then you come back and you go, our hands are tied. We have to go by the book, and we have to do this because it's required, or it's not allowed. And so that's one of the things that I want to just say is when you're crafting new regulations, it's important to think through that, just so you're not prohibiting people from doing stuff like that.
Yeah, and so we need to get engineering and public works involved in the discussion to make sure that they're on board with all this stuff.
Yeah, you kind of hit on something I was going to mention. The developers come in and they build these developments, they put in their little playgrounds and stuff like that, and then they're out. And then they depend on the HOAs to take care of them. But in the HOAs, everybody's excited when they first open. Oh, yeah, we got all this stuff. But 20 years down the road, what happens? I just think that needs to be a consideration in the codes and stuff, is the HOA management. Who's watching that? Who's making sure that, 15, 20 years down the road, somebody's still going to be taking care of it. Now, if it's just green space, it's one thing, but, if they put playgrounds, pools, and stuff like that, what happens when nobody's maintaining them? So that just needs to be a consideration.
Yeah.
And then the one other thing I did want to mention, you had talked about tree preservation. I think that was maybe discussed in one of the other, but I think that is very, very important. I said I'm a lifelong resident here, and I know when we had that spurt of development on Nashville Pike a few years ago, it was heartbreaking to just see them just came out, because the developers, what do they want to do? First thing they want to do when they buy something is clear it off, because they want to start from scratch. But to take some of those trees, 50, 60, 70, some of them 100 years old, and they just bulldoze them down. It was just heartbreaking. And, you know, we've got a lot of houses that's still there on Nashville Pike, but, you know, it's just a matter of time before the cost is going to overtake those, and then they're going to tear those down. So we just need to have some stuff in place to make sure that those trees are preserved, and they have to build around them other than just bringing in the bulldozers and clearing them out.
Yeah.
That's a great point. So I wanted to speak just a little bit to the point about flexibility in the zoning ordinance. You know, I've had numerous conversations with folks, and I think I say it more than anybody on the Planning Commission when we get projects that come in. You know, hotels are a really good one to talk about, where the first thing they do is, well, we need a variance on the 70% brick rule. And, you know, I constantly encourage applicants to don't be afraid to ask for that variance, because a lot of times, you know, that 70% brick requirement, I don't know if anybody knows how far that goes back in the ordinances, but I think it goes back to like somewhere in the 1960s in the City of Gallatin ordinances. And, you know, as building materials have changed, that clearly doesn't. But when an applicant goes in to meet with planning staff, they don't have necessarily the flexibility to say, hey, you know, yeah, I see it's a 70% brick stone requirement, but why don't you consider these other options? You know, city planning staffs typically, you know, they're gonna apply the ordinance as it's written. And so if there's a way to provide some flexibility when someone comes in with that project, says, hey, here's a couple of options, or whether it's open space, whether it's that retention pond, a brick stone requirement, so that projects, as they're working through the process with the city staff, a developer's not pigeonholed in, so to say, and saying, hey, I've got to do it exactly this way, even though it really doesn't make sense here. And, you know, rather than getting the answer if you have to do it this way. And we saw that with over on the airport authority, bringing a project through where, you know, there was a road alignment the airport needed because it made a lot of sense for the growth and future of the airport. The first thing the engineering staff said was, you can't do that because it doesn't meet this ordinance. And I had to explain to the engineers working on the airport project that that's the only answer they're allowed to give you, because that's what the regulation says. That's the answer they're going to give you. And if you haven't worked in the city long enough, you don't necessarily feel comfortable saying, hey, I need a variance, and here's the story why. So as we're going through the process, I think it would be important to have those tools for the planners who do this for a living, to be able to bring things through planning commission, through city council, that are, you know, deviations within allowable limits, that say, hey, here's what the ordinance says, here's what really makes a lot of sense, it's going to be a better project, it's going to make the green space more usable, whatever that is, that we're writing, you know, policy in a way that gives some flexibility for those unique opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Matt and Bill have touched on is really important for there to be flexibility within the ordinance and within, if the city goes forward with an open space requirement, so that if it's a infill lot in the city, if it's part of the redevelopment corridor on South Water, if the requirement's going to end up with 6 square feet of formal open space, perhaps a fee in lieu of option to better support the parks master plan, or something larger, more substantial, more meaningful towards the city would be a better option than a picnic bench and a planter, both for the residents and for the city as a whole.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that too. I mean, there are going to be small lots that will be developed, and there may not be opportunities for those small lots to really do much in the way of open space. And so I think some kind of mechanism that allows them to, you know, allows it to be fair for what they're doing and still provide something to the open space, you know, in the city, without necessarily having to do it on that site. You know, a fee in lieu is a great example of doing something like that, and an option to be able to do that would be really helpful, I think. And that way, city can then use that towards open space in another location that makes a lot more sense. I think, you just have to look at it and make sure that people are doing it across the board fairly. You don't want to not require it on somebody and require it on other people, but you got to do it where it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way we typically do that is based on the acreage of the development, you know. So like one of the things you want to do is encourage, you know, a small mom and pop person who may have a lot or 2 lots or something they want to do something with, and sort of this more incremental scale development that's appropriate in today's world. You know, not everybody can be a large scale developer, and in fact, when you are getting the large scale developments, they're not exactly, y'all aren't singing their praises much, right? So, and then to say to somebody who's sort of bootstrapping a project but trying to do something neat, it's a little passion project of theirs, now you've got to have the same open space requirement. To your point, it's now some little ridiculous unusable space, that wouldn't make sense, but may not even on a small enough project make sense to have a fee and make them pay a fee, you know, because disincentivizing them to do something with their little piece of heaven. But we have ways to deal with that, but it's a good point to be thinking about as we go. So we're 7 minutes over, so we'll do one more.
I just wanted to say one of the most valuable things that we hear when we do community meetings all over Middle Tennessee is we ask, what would you like to see in the open space? And I just want to encourage everybody here, if you have an idea, please write it down, feed it to folks here, because one of the things that keeps popping into my head, probably because as a kid I worked in a garden with my mom, is community gardens. And I think there's a lot of details around how to make those work well and put them in the right place that need to be worked out. But I think there's an overlap with folks that are searching for better ways for nutrition and better ways to gather together, better ways to get to know each other. Just want to thank y'all for the comments on the dog park. I mean, things like that are the types of things that we need to continue to hear to help us develop better connection, better neighborhoods for our families, and better for the community. So thank you.
All right, so tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock in here is the wrap-up of everything. So the presentation will happen at 6, and then we'll do questions and answers at the end. So please make sure you don't miss it. It'll be actually probably the most interesting thing that we've done all the days we've been here. And bring people with you, carpool so you don't make extra traffic. But even if you do have to drive yourself, still tell other people to come, because we'd like to have a full house, because, you know, shoot, we're just making the rules and regulations for the future of your city. It's no big deal, right? We want to get it right. We need your input. Thanks.